right, you got until here. That was the hardest part. Now let's review disorders related to the immune system. Okay, we're going to talk about hypersensitivity and what that means in the simple, simple words is an overreaction of your immune system to something that it shouldn't cause significant. It's your immune system being exaggerated, okay, with something like uh, you trying to kill a mosquito with a shotgun, right? Something like that. So there are four types of hypersensitivities, and so hypersensitivity type 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let's cover each of them. I will tell you that the two more important ones, well, all of them are important because specific disorders. But I will say let's review the first one. Okay, so immediate. That means that when you have an immediate, very quickly, like in seconds, in a few minutes, reaction, is called immediate hypersensitivity or type 1 hypersensitivity type 1, right? This is classic for anaphylactic or allergic reactions. Okay, so very important. Anaphylactic shock, severe allergies. The type of hypersensitivity you develop is type 1. And this type 1 is characterized by IgE. So in other words, what happens is, let's say that you're allergic to shrimp, just to give you an example. The way how you get allergic to shrimp is because, let's say, initially you have to get exposed to that, or there are people who had latex hypersensitivity, or you become allergic to something. Very, extremely rarely, you will become allergic to something without getting exposed to that first. What that means is that if you're allergic to shrimp, there was a point where you were not allergic to shrimp, right? And again, I'm telling you, most of the cases, there are very rare cases that you're allergic just right away, but the vast majority, you have what we call a period of sensitization. So that means that you become sensitive, you get exposed to that pathogen for the first time. And the first time you will not get sick, right? But you generate these antibodies, IgE, which are the ones that attach to the mast cells. And then when you eat for the second time, then is when this allergen react with the antibody and the degranulation occurs. And this degranulation is pretty dangerous because it causes inflammation. If it's in the respiratory system, will cause bronchoconstriction, meaning making the airway narrow. It will stimulate mucus production, which it just make it worse. If this is in your blood, it's pretty bad because in the blood, these chemicals that are released, they're vasoactive, meaning that they cause vasodilation. What that means is they dilate your arteries, and then you have a sudden and abrupt low blood pressure because all your arteries, because this is circulating in the blood, all the arteries will dilate at the same time because of the chemical is causing dilation, that your blood will drop, will have severe uh, low blood pressure, and then that's what causes anaphylaxis or anaphylactic shock. How do you fix that? Okay, if you remember what everybody has, that they know that they have allergies to a specific stuff, they have an EpiPen. Why they need an EpiPen? Because the main problem, the main thing that will kill them is low blood pressure, is hypotension that is generated by this histamine and all these chemicals that the cells are releasing. So epinephrine or adrenaline, what it's going to do is going to contrast the effect of vasodilation. So epinephrine will cause vasoconstriction, and then when you have EpiPen and you have an allergic reaction, then your do not have this, or this vasoconstriction will occur, and that will increase your blood pressure, and that will save your life. Eventually, your body will get rid of the allergen, and then you will, you will be safe. But what happens if you don't have one? What happens if you don't have an EpiPen, or if you don't have access to go to the hospital? That's when you have severe allergic reaction that can be fatal, right? Either because of anaphylactic shock, or because they swallow your upper airway and then you cannot breathe, etc. So EpiPen, adrenaline, the main purpose of that is to cause vasoconstriction that directly act contrasting the vasodilation that takes place when you have hypersensitivity type 1. Type 2 hypersensitivity is similar to type 1 in the way that you have antibodies that are formed. Now, just remember that the antibodies in the type 1, they are attached to the mast cells, right? So when you have an allergen, that allergen will attach to that mast cells, and the mast cells will release the chemical. Now, in type 2, these antibodies, instead of being attached to the cells, you have preformed antibodies. And the classic example, by the way, about this one is blood transfusion when there's problems with compatibility. These preformed antibodies, when you get exposed to a blood type that is not compatible, these antibodies will attach to the cells. And then once they attach to the cells, remember what happens with bacteria, or what happens with your blood when they create agglutination, right? And then agglutination itself is pretty bad because essentially our blood clots. So that's terrible. But also, when you have all these white blood cells, all these red blood cells together, that also um, activates that in some degree. Some cells can attach and destroy other cells that are targeted by those antibodies. So remember, antibodies are things that basically mark a target point for your immune cells to destroy. So in this case, that is an example of type 2. You don't have to know all these details specifically, but just keep in mind hypersensitivity type 1, you need to know that for sure, because first, it's pretty serious, it's pretty common. And then type 2, blood transfusion. Type 3, hypersensitivity, we're just going to mention here, is the formation of immunocomplex. So that means antigen antibody complex will deposit in your tissues, and then that will trigger the release of chemicals by immune cells like neutrophils. So, for example, you have here a blood vessel. You have these specific antibodies attached to a specific antigens, and um, that's what we call a complex, right? In self, the complex, just like that, it will not cause problems. So right now, there's not a big deal. But the thing is, when you have a complex, that is something that um, alert or stimulates, especially neutrophils, to go to that complex and release chemicals to try to destroy that complex. It's just your immune system doesn't know what that means. You just know that something is going on, and they will destroy it. That's a type 3 hypersensitivity. There are specific conditions, especially related with autoimmune disorders, that has this mechanism. So far, if you have to pick from the 4 types, I will say this is the less high yield for you to know. I'm not saying it's not important, because it's important in practice, but from the 4 that you have, in order of prioritizing which one you must know, you need to, in this order, I will say 1, 4, which I'm going to explain next, then 2, and then leave this at the end. Right, the last one is called the delayed hypersensitivity, or type 4. All the ones that we mentioned before that were related with antibodies, This one is related to cell. So it's a T cell response, and it's called delay because it takes a lot of time for you to have this reaction. The classic example of this is the TB test. Okay, so what that means is that, for example, the tuberculin skin test is a test that is detecting if you have been exposed to the Mycobacterium tuberculosum, which is the bacteria that causes TB. And if you've never been exposed to that, we're not expecting to see a reaction. If you have been exposed to that, you will have a reaction. But what's going to happen? You're going to have this um, chemical that will be injected in your epidermis, and then you're going to have to leave and go back in 3 days to see that reaction. That's why it's called delay, because it takes time to develop. And but then and the reason why it takes time is because it's not composed by antibodies that are formed. Is a cellular type of hypersensitivity, and it's a hypersensitivity because your cells kind of overreact to that. Another example that we can see, especially in the south, is when you have poison ivy, right? Poison ivy dermatitis. When you have contact with the plant, you might not develop any rashes or any inflammation or problems immediately, but you will develop it later, hours later. So that's another example of type 4 hypersensitivity. That was your immune system overreacting to stuff. Now, let's review very quickly what happens when your immune system attacks yourself, attacks your tissues. All you need to know are specific diseases that are considered as autoimmune. This list is, of course, not complete. I mean, there's way more diseases. These are the most important ones that you need to know for your exams and for, at this point. So the first one, make sure you know diabetes type 1 is one of the examples, right? Diabetes type 1, you become diabetic because your immune system destroy your pancreatic cells, the cells that produce insulin, and then that leads to low insulin production, which then causes high sugar in blood, which causes diabetes. Now, different than type 2, I hope at this point you remember why, but again, diabetes type 1 is an autoimmune disorder. You become insufficient in insulin because destruction of the beta cells in the pancreas. Another examples of that, Graves' disease. Remember that for hyperthyroidism and the exophthalmos, that protrusion of the eyeball, that was Graves' disease. That's an autoimmune disorder as well. Hashimoto's thyroiditis is another example of autoimmune disease. This, in contrast to Graves' disease, this causes hypothyroidism. And there are other ones like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, celiac disease. All of these ones are autoimmune. Now, do not confuse autoimmune with infectious diseases, right? Infectious diseases are like influenza. You become sick because the virus, the influenza virus, or if you have any other infectious diseases, um, it, that doesn't mean you're becoming sick because you have an infection. Now, this autoimmune system, there's not a pathogen going around. There's nothing that is causing a disease. It's for reasons that are genetic or environmental. You become your immune system start attacking your own tissues, and so just make sure you know the difference between an infectious disease versus an autoimmune disease. Almost done. Tissue transplantation, very little. What you need to know for your exams, you just know that there are patients that in some point they need a transplant. Patient examples of this: people with cirrhosis, people with chronic kidney diseases that might need a kidney transplant, or people with a cornea. There's a cornea transplant, heart transplant. There are transplants for a lot of parts. What is the thing that you need to be careful there? Is that how your immune system will respond to those organs that obviously do not belong to them, right? So in order for you to get an organ, you have to have a match, because otherwise, as soon as you put the organ in your body, your immune system will recognize that as a foreign and will attack that the tissue in the transplant will transplantation will fail, right? So first you need to find a match that, you know, the antigens in those organs match, or they're very similar to yours. And then all patients with organ transplant will require a specific immunosuppressive drugs that will prevent the immune system to attack the graft, they attack the transplantation, right? Of course, if somebody has an organ, a transplantation, and they are taking immunosuppressive or high doses of steroids, those patients obviously are in risk to develop diseases. They're immunosuppressive, so you have to keep an eye on them, because infections can, easily get them, and they can get very sick very quickly because the immune system is suppressed all that for to try to maintain these organs. And we do that because their organs are so important that without them you will not be able to live long. So that is pretty much what you need to know about transplantation. And then there is a condition called graft versus host disease. Okay, this is pretty interesting. I would say not super high yield to know, but sometimes remember that leukemia is a type of cancer that happens in your blood. So eventually, and it is primarily in kids, when somebody develops a leukemia, the definitive treatment is a bone marrow transplant. So what you do, and in general, again, I'm being very general, what you do is that you kill all the red blood cells that are cancer in that patient. So with radiation and chemotherapy, you get rid of the whole leukocytes in the blood. And eventually you pretty much destroy the the bone marrow in the bones. So then you're going to add a new bone marrow, okay, to those patients, because they still, of course, they need those cells. So what that means, graft versus host disease, is that in the case of a bone marrow transplantation, the bone marrow cells of the transplant, the ones that the patient just received, they're going to start making white blood cells. But the problem is, because this bone marrow do not belongs to the patient, sometimes the white blood cells that are produced by the bone marrow will react against the patient. And that is pretty sad. So the donor cells may attack the tissues of the recipient. And that is it's not super common, but that's what that means. Graft versus host disease is in a specific situation in which immune cells of the donor will attack the recipient. For the vast majority of the cases is the opposite, right? Is the immune system of the recipient the one that reject the organ donor. Just to complete this class, we talk about immunosuppression when we review organ transplant, and also cancer, right? You know that one way how you get rid of the cancer is when your immune system, especially those cytotoxic T cells, destroy cancer cells. When you are immunosuppressed, or when you have a specific conditions like HIV, for example, there are specific cancers that can arise because there's not the component of the lymphocytes stopping for those cancers to grow, right? And there's one that is associated with HIV infections, right? This is called Kaposi's sarcoma. It's a disease that is caused by human herpes virus. Human herpes virus never leaves the body. It remains once you get infection with human herpes virus. There's many type of herpes, but when you get this, your body never cleans or get rid of the infection. So the virus might remain dormant in your body, and then if you have a good immune system, you will never get a reactivation or you will never get sick, even though the virus is still there. Now, what happens in people with HIV, specifically with AIDS, is that the immune system becomes very weak. That then this herpes virus that was dormant or that it was just sleeping and being just contained, then will cause what we call Kaposi's sarcoma, and this is how it looks. Those lesions in the skin of the patients. This is very specific. Kaposi's sarcoma was very specific for people who has AIDS caused by HIV. Look at you, you made it. That concludes our class. Hope you do well. Let me know if you have any questions about the immune system, and I wish you the best in the exams.